सर सुनाई नहीं दे रहा सर। मनोज जी आप म्यूट हैं क्या? मनोज जी मुझे मैं सुनाई दे रहा हूँ, आप सुनाई नहीं दे रहे?
नहीं हम म्यूट किए हुए थे सर। हम
ओके कोई बात नहीं ठीक है। मैंने सोचा कि सर हमारा सिस्टम में कुछ हो गया क्या?
नहीं सर ठीक है सर। नाउ वी कैन स्टार्ट सर, ऑलरेडी पार्टिसिपेंट आर देयर, सो वी कैन स्टार्ट सो दैट विद इन टाइम वी कैन फिनिश सर।
I think, dear friends, you have had your little break, and I know the academic sessions are very engaging, and you don't have much time to take your lunch or tea or dinner or whatever. And it all seems that since we are dedicated towards ideas, and ideas tend to make us go crazy. I think you all remember that what the former President of India, Abul Kalam Azad, said once, that ideas are something that doesn't let us sleep in the night. If we have really bright ideas, we will not be able to sleep in the night, because the ideas in themselves will motivate us to go for action and to realize those ideals rather than go to sleep. And that is how I think academics are also of the same order, that where we need to be vibrant with the ideas, and we also need to be dedicated towards ideas, so that we are able to achieve those limited goals that we have set for ourselves as academicians, and we'll be able to sort of do the bit for the society as the society expects us to do. I think with these few words, we will start the next session. And since we talked of the inclusiveness as an aspect of today's policies of multiculturalism, we will talk of another aspect of state policy, which tends to be a kind of a continuation of the colonial ideas, and we will see as to whether any particular community, being the equal members of Indian society, tends to get pushed back into corner rather than occupying the center stage, as this must do, by way of the problems or the discomfiture or the discomforts that they are faced with because of the prevalence of a present-day system. I think when you talk of present-day system, I think I've titled this lecture. This is one of the lecture which is very close to me, and which we are working on to understand as to how this present-day phenomenon that is continuing in our own society can be reformed, can be transformed, and probably can be brought to its own logical state, where every individual, every citizen is ensured his or her basic fundamental rights, or as you call it, human rights, then what is happening at the present. I think that way, we have talked about, I've titled the lecture as prisons and the criminal justice system in India, the present day scenario, and in particularly we will look at it as to how this particular system is functioning, and how it is, and whether it is functioning in the real earnest or not, and whether this particular system tends to call for any kind of reform that is supposed to be there in our own society. I think here, when you talk about, just give me a minute, I will do it. Let me put it on recording. Yeah, just 1 minute. Just 1 minute, because 1 minute, please. Yeah, I think this is something that we'll be talking about today, the prison and the criminal justice system in India, the present scenario. We'll also talk about the challenges which are there, and whether the challenges can be met by our present day system, and what we need to do about it. I think when you talk about the prisons, we all are very familiar with prison, and I always say that prison is something that reminds us of our own existence. As we say, there is birth, there is death, and as there is freedom, there is also the opposite of freedom, as we call it, the so-called system of imprisonment. But this prison system that we talk about in the context of the criminal justice system is different from the imprisonment that we tend to find ourselves in the various in various parts of our own living, be it in the home. You may differ that home is not a prison, but we know that some kind of imprisonment has been voiced forth by the people who tend to live within the home. But there are also other kind of imprisonment that we are often subjected to by virtue of our being placed in at a particular level in our own society, and which we tend to call it a state of unfreedom or a state of imprisonment. So, but in this particular prison that we talk about will be talked about particularly in the so-called political legal angle as to how the prison system tend to have been developed by the society, and also how the same prison system tend to have been continued in some form or the other, and much particularly within the criminal justice system, which tends to have contributed towards the so-called unfreedom of the prisoners. We know prisoners are not entitled to freedom, but then the prisoners also are entitled to some kind of human rights, even if they are under the custody of the state, which is what known as the prison system is, and also the kind of human rights that they should be entitled to, they should be able to enjoy within the prison system, and how those human rights tend to have been either respected or violated by the state, given its own resource limitation that it often tends to talk about, and how it tends to lead to, as we so-called, the moral degradation of the society vis-a-vis the so-called degradation or the deterioration of human living standard of the so-called prisoners. I think before we go a little bit into detail about our present-day prison system in India, we need to understand as to why was it felt to be necessary to have a prison in our own country. I think whenever we talk of the so-called criminal justice system, I think if you are students of political science, we are all reminded of Jeremy Bentham, who tend to have contributed towards the origin of prison system in UK, and he was a very famous eminent thinker of jurisprudence, where he not only talked of the law, he also emphasized on the punitive aspects of punitive aspects for the people of the criminal justice system, where if people tend to be deviant in nature, how they should be subjected to a particular kind of a treatment, which will lead to the reformation within the human beings who may have been accused of or guilty of having committed offenses against the society, and also how they should be reformed in order to make them eligible, in order to enable them to live as equal members of the same human society without being subjected to any kind of discrimination. But I think when you talk about the prison, we all know that I will not go much detail, because if we had more time, we would probably go into the Bentham's ideas of criminal jurisprudence and the criminology, and also how it has led to the so-called perpetuation of the, as I call it myself, the perpetuation of injustices to which the so-called prisoners are subjected to, even if they have been found guilty by the so-called criminal justice system. So when you talk about the prison, we all remember that the prison, the very conceptualization of the prison was that of a correctional system. It was not something to put people in the background and to forget them forever, but the prison system was evolved or was conceptualized in the human mind so as to ensure that it is a correctional facilities rather than it is a condemnational facilities. A prison is not a system where the deviant people within a particular human society should be condemned forever and should not be afforded any chance to reform themselves, should not be denied any chance to come back to, as we call it, the mainstream of human life, to mainstream of human society, to live as equal member of the society. So we must agree and remember that the prison was discovered or was conceptualized as a correctional facility, and it was conceived to house those individuals who were primarily treated as who primarily were proved to have been the violators of the so-called social laws. I think when we talk about the laws, we tend to understand laws seem to be a kind of laws seem to be a kind of a plethora or a collection of certain legal moral principles which were found to be beneficial for the human society, so as to ensure that everyone's human dignity is protected, and nobody's dignity is violated by anybody, whosoever he may be, or whatever positions he may be placed in, or whatever may be his status in the human society. I think when you talk about the Article 14 in Indian Constitution, we all know Article 14 tends to be assuring equality before law and equal protection of law. I think if you are familiar with the judicial pronouncements, with the judgments of the Supreme Court and the High Court, the judges tend to be never tired of emphasizing that whoever you may be, law, everyone is equal before the eyes of the law. So that way, the law has been law, or the collection of laws has been, legal principles have been enacted by the society through the in a democracy, through the popularly elected parliament or national or state legislative assemblies, where the various legal principles, as we call it, the law or the acts, have been enacted in order to ensure that no act of deviance is allowed to be committed by anybody, any member of the human society, which may go against the so-called human right of the individuals, and also it will not violate the so-called amity and peaceful atmosphere in the society, which work to everyone's benefit. So prison is primarily a correctional system, but it was a correctional system for whom? Not for everyone, but for those who are the violators of the law, who have breached the so-called well-accepted moral and legal principle of the society, and who have broken the law by their own act of, as you call it, by own act of mischief, or by their own acts of commission. So the broad purpose of the prison was not primarily imprisonment of the people, but it was primarily the reformation of the inmates. It was believed that if human beings are separated from the circumstances, from the social situations which may have contributed towards their committing the so-called morally reprehensible, legally prohibited acts of violence, which have gone against the other fellow human beings within the same society, it was believed that probably the so-called offenders, or whom we call very popularly criminals, can get a chance to reform if they are excluded, if they are separated from those situations where which might have acted as we call it, trigger points for their committing of the offenses. There may be differences in our own expression, in our own belief, whether a person commits a crime by virtue of the existing social reality or social situations, or he tends to commit by way of his own or her self-desire. We all understand that all the offenses which are committed within the society certainly tend to be not everyone's desire, but at one point of time, as we have seen in the movies, and when you talk about movies, please do not believe that movies are simply some kind of a daydream, but movies often tend to be reflective of the social reality as it is present in the society, and movies only tend to present them in a dramatized form, but nonetheless they are not devoid of reality. So movies, there's a very famous discussion that goes on between the movies and the society as to who contributes to what, whether movies tend to reflect the society or society tends to reflect the movie. But we can see at the end that it is the movies which tend to reflect the society. Although there is a bit of a dramatization involved somewhere, there's a bit of a entertainment angle involved somewhere, but nonetheless the movies are often not devoid from reality as they present in the human society. So, and we find, as we have seen in the movies, we come back to movies, we see that movies often tend to portray the various kinds of crime in its own seriousness, in its own intensity, as they are performed, as they have been committed against people, and how those same acts of crimes, as we say, tend to have left a series of consequences on its trail, and which tend to have not only created havoc in the society, which also tends to have contributed towards the so-called discomfort of the families, and often have also resulted in the complete breakdown of the families, because of the fact that somebody or some group of people tend to have had the audacity to commit those acts which are no less reprehensible, moral reprehensible as crime, and can be categorized as the so-called crime under the criminal justice system. I think when you talk of the criminal justice system, without going into its own origin, we all know that India follows an Anglo-Saxon system of jurisprudence, where the criminals, where anybody who is accused of committing a particular crime, tend to be not regarded as a criminal, so to say, is rather categorized as an accused, or as an offender, and he is given equal opportunity to defend his own act before the so-called courts of law, which are parts of the so-called criminal justice system. And until any accused person is proven to be guilty, is not considered to be guilty in the eyes of the law. No matter how the society tends to consider that particular offender as guilty, but in the eyes of the law, until his guilt is proven, as we say in the language of the courts of law, that beyond any reasonable doubt, the person continues to be treated as a non-criminal in the eyes of the law, and more particularly before the so-called courts of criminal justice system, which are authorized by the Constitution to consider those, to arbitrate over the cases of offences as permissible by law. So when we come back to our own center point of the lecture, we find that these prisons were in the beginning to start with correctional facility, and they were also conceived to house individuals who are accused of violating the so-called laws of the society. And the broad purpose of the prison was primarily a kind of a reformation process, and it was supposed to be treated as a correctional facility rather than as a system of condemnation, and where probably the individuals should not be given a chance to come back to the male life. But the idea was that if they are enabled and separated from the so-called trigger points in any kind of a social situation which might have motivated them to commit certain crimes, to reform themselves, to bring about a change in their own conduct, which will make them socially eligible to live as equal members of the same society of which they were one part of. But then in reality, we find that the prisons tend to be, whenever we talk of prisons, I think the prisons tend to be reminding us of very harsh and life-threatening conditions as was present during the Soviet Gulag system. I think when you talk about the Soviet Russia, and more particularly during Stalin's rule, you find that Soviet system used to follow a particular prison system which was known as the Gulag system, where people were simply thrown into the prisons to condemn themselves rather than were afforded any chance to reform themselves so as to be able to come back to the same society of which they were part of. And when you talk of the Soviet Gulag system, we all remember that how the Soviet prison systems were the most feared system. I think when you talk of Stalin, we must remember that during Stalin's rule, who succeeded Lenin in the event of the Soviet social revolution of 1918, we find that 1.5 million people, Soviet people, tend to have disappeared after having been condemned, after having been subjected to imprisonment under the Soviet Gulag system, and how the Stalin's rule, even now, when you remind Stalin and its rule, how that particular period is much feared because of the atrocity that were committed on human life, and the political opponents who were tortured by Stalin and who never came back to live the life in the society as corrected human beings. So why Soviet Gulag system was much feared? Simply because we know the Soviet Gulag system tend to have been known for the high degree of isolation that it tends to have contained within itself. So although prisons we tend to talk about as a system of isolation, where you talk about that the accuser, the offender, the accuser, the accused persons are isolated from the society. They are kept in a, if you have visited in a prison, you must have seen they are kept in a kind of isolated place, which is far removed from the so-called, as we call it, city center of human life, and they are kept in a corner, kept in a remote place in an isolated manner, where they are not only separated from the human beings, but because of the fact that they have misused their own free status or freedom within the society, they are subjected to certain grueling labor conditions, and often they are also subjected to some kind of psychological treatment by the system, as it was believed that by such things they probably could be able to reform themselves than what they did when they were not, when they were free members of the society. So when you talk about Soviet Gulag system, we know Soviet Gulag system. If you visit internet, you'll probably find that how the Gulag system tends to be almost in the nature of a torture chamber, where people were not only subjected to live in isolation from each other, they were also subjected to very hard, grueling labor, as was the case during the system of 200 years of slavery that the people from Africa and from other parts of the world were subjected to. And we also know that under Soviet Gulag system, the prisons were also centers of psychological torture or psychological torment, where people were not able to live life in one piece, as we call it, with a sane of mind, and they were rendered insane, having been subjected to the imprisonment under the rule of the then Russian President Joseph Stalin. So I think, and then so the prisons, hence from that on, that picture of Soviet Gulag system seems to be very much in the minds of the people as of today. And prisons are probably the most feared system, more feared places, as we can say, in today's modern day civilized world, where anybody who is subjected to any kind of a imprisonment tend to be not only treated as an object of scorn, but they are also often believed that once they are condemned to imprisonment, they probably would not be able to come back alive back into our own society, for the simple reason that neither the society would accept them back as very sane human being. And mostly we have also seen that given the administration of the prison system, people who, although some people who get released from prison tend to have become very, very insane, given the fact that they were condemned to live in such inhumanly environment that they were not able to keep their mental balance and have become the so-called object of insanity. Anyway, so here when you talk about it, the Soviet Gulag system, we find that it was believed that the Soviet Gulag system was often the place where people were not only subject to isolation, they were also condemned. You can say they were directed to render grueling labor within the so-called unfriendly or unpleasantly prison conditions, and they were also often subject to psychological torment. And these prison systems were known as the so-called penal colonies, because these were all we all understand these are all places of punishment. These are not to be treated places of pleasure. So where people were supposed to be punished, but not punished so brutally as to leave their own sense of human worth and would become a mere, as we call it, mere vegetables, and would not be able to become productive members of the same human society from where they were separated by virtue of their own acts of offense or commission. So here we find that, largely when you look into the prison system, we find that the conditions in prisons and detention centers, although they are often scary, but we can also see generally that they also often vary. But nonetheless, the prison system today tend to be almost life-threatening, and also are often described as very, very harsh. So so that way we get to understand that prisons are probably prisons probably have not changed as much as they should change. As civilization tends to have taken their civilizations tend to have shifted from one state of development to other advanced stage of development, which tends to be much better than compared with what it used to be before. So here we find, when we go a little further, we find according to 2021 State Department report on Russian human rights abuses, I think the US State Department tends to have categorized the Russian prison system as they continue as the remnants of the Soviet Gulag system, as being subjected to overcrowding, where more people tend to be living within the Russian prison system than what is the actual capacity. And Russian prison system are also often categorized by the US report as having guards who often tend to abuse the prisoners rather than abuse the prisoners and the inmates rather than work for the protection of the so-called human rights and dignity of the prisoners. And also the Russian prisoners are also very well known for not having very well equipped healthcare system, which the prisoners as human beings are entitled to, and also tend to be denied of access to healthcare, tend to have food shortages within the prison, and also tend to have inadequate sanitation, which tend to go against the so-called well-accepted human rights international standards as accepted by the whole world or human community. So why we talk of Russian prison? Because as we know, whenever, I think apart from 1931, if you remember, reminded about the which you talked about in the first lecture about the genocide, I think we now find that the Russian Gulag system is probably the second most torturous system that we see after the German prisons, which were there in existence during the so-called genocide. Because as you know, prisons during genocide, prisons were the places where the so-called people who were taken into imprisonment were merely killed without being afforded any chance to defend. And the same thing happened under the Stalin's rule, where the prisoners never had any chance to defend themselves and were subjected to all kind of mistreatment, or if you like, maltreatment, which the so-called modern day human civilization does not admit of or do not allow such practices to be continued by any state or by any society. I think according to when you talk about in general, when you talk about according to the various other reports as have been published by various international organizations, we often say that the physical and sexual abuse by prison guards is also reported to be systemic. I think the prison system from merely from becoming the centers of physical abuse, it has now also, as we read in the newspapers, they have also become places of sexual abuse, where most particularly both the male and the women prisoners, including child prisoners, above 18 years of age, when they are the inmates of in any prison, are also often subjected to sexual abuse, not only by their own inmates, but also by the prison guards who have been primarily deputed to protect them. And here in the prison system, we find that the protectors tend to have also become predators. So here we find that the systemic torture of prisoners tend to be very pervasive, and at times it tends to have contributed towards the death or suicide of the so-called fellow prison inmates who have been the subject of so-called physical abuse. So here we also tend to be reminded of the fact that in prisons we also find that, given the fact that they are isolated centers, the prisoners are often subjected to discriminatory treatment by the prison guards, and also discretionary treatment by the prison guards, where we find that more particularly the women or the female gender, and also the children and the people of color tend to have often become the subject of torture rather than the people, rather than the local people who might have been the inmates of the same prison. I think when you talk of the prison system, we also have to remember that the law also does not prohibit discrimination. And when you talk of the criminal justice system, as we talked about Anglo-Saxon system jurisprudence, the law does not allow any kind of discrimination of prison amongst the prisoners on any consideration, be it on the basis of sexual orientation, be it on the basis of any other racial divergence. No discrimination is allowed by the law, and hence everybody within the prison is supposed to be treated as in the same manner as any other person, and not to be treated as an object of scorn. But we find, given the fact that we tend to talk about the prison system, we have talked about the prison system being very, very scary, and it seems to be so scary simply because that within the prison system we find that prisoners tend to be the most vulnerable persons within the prison system. I think we as free individuals, we may not be able to understand or the level of vulnerability they are subjected to, but we all understand that anytime a person is subjected to prison, to imprisonment, to go to prison, or to, as we say, to go to jail, we know that that particular person tends to break down the moment he or she hears the judgment that is passed out in the court of law, in various courts of law before him or her by the so-called sitting judge about the period that one has to serve imprisonment by being sent to jail. So prisons tend to be, and prisoners tend to be extremely vulnerable amongst the human beings the moment they tend to be subject to imprisonment, and they tend to be sent to jail to serve their sentence by virtue of the sentence or judgment that is passed by the court for the offense that they have supposedly committed and have been proved beyond doubt in the eyes of the law. So, and when you talk of the scary conditions of the prison, we all know that there is a very famous human rights organizations, international human rights organization, which tends to function to preserve and protect the human rights of the individuals, irrespective of origin. Amnesty International tend to have noted that the prisoners are not only vulnerable, but that some prisons are also known to be treating incarcerated people or imprisoned people like cattle. Because the point is, the moment anybody is subject to prison, it is believed by the prison guards and by the criminal and by the prison system as that those people who have been treated who have been asked to serve imprisonment do not, as if they do not have human rights, and they can be treated in any manner, as we often tend to treat the animals who may come across us either by accident or by choice. So here we find that they not only in general within the prison system, the incarcerated people or the people who have been asked to serve imprisonment are often treated like cattle, but one even tend to have, and because of the scary conditions, certain prisoners tend to have also threatened hunger strike to demand that certain conditions as they prevail within the prisons, as they are inhospitable to the prisoners as basic living human beings, need to be reformed, and also there have been demand that the prisons must also have a kind of a well worked out system where the human rights of the human beings are protected, rather than their human rights are taken for granted, and the human beings, the prisoners are not allowed to enjoy any kind of human right as they tend to deserve by virtue of being the member of the same society of which criminal justice system is a part of. I think so far we could understand that the way the prison system tends to have continued till today. There has not been much change in the prison system, while there may have been changes which may have taken place within the society, be it in the direction of development, or be it in the direction of development of certain basic amenities which we are all able to enjoy as members of the same society. But then we tend to see that while things have changed in the society, the prisons seem to be almost the replica or continuation of the, as we call it, old dungeon houses, as was conceptualized in the so-called pre-modern times. I think when you talk of prison, why you talk of pre-modern times? Because prisons are in any case not the discovery of the modern day times, but it has been continuing maybe as old as human beings tend to have had a settled life then as of today. So here I think and some as you know, according to amongst the intellectuals, some tend to maintain that prison systems are not to be treated as dungeon houses, but they are primarily meant to cater to men and are not well equipped to address the various needs of the prisoners. And when you talk about the more particularly about the women prisoners, because we know amongst if you look into the figures of the NCRB, National Crime Records Bureau, you'll find that there is also a rapid, while we have primarily regarded men being the majority prisoners in the jails, which is even now today, but there is also a kind of a rapid increase in the number of women prisoners who are also found to have committed crimes in our own society and in the present world, and tend to have been also subjected to the same imprisonment as has been the fate of the men who have been proved to be the so-called guilty persons by the courts of the law. So, and it has been also pointed out that when there has been a there's an increase in the number of the women prisoners, the prison system, which was totally ill-equipped to maintain, to provide for the facilities as permissible by law to the male prisoners, it is found that with the women prisoners being added to the so-called prison system, the same jail system or the prison system tend to be almost busting at steam, simply because it even doesn't have the basic facilities for the women prisoners, given the fact that the prisons tend to have not been treated as centers of as items of reform, rather have been treated as items of condemnation. So here we find that the feminists tend to say that the so-called modern day prisoners tend to be ill-equipped to house the women prisoners, even if they are subjected to the sentence by the so-called criminal courts, simply because that the modern day prisons do not have the so-called women-centric facilities which are required for the women prisoners to live with their dignity, as they tend to have different needs compared to that of the so-called male prison systems, to the so-called male prisoners. And here we find that they tend to say that the present prison systems often hide the violence and the depravity that tend to take place between the closed doors, and hence such depravity as the present in the present prison system tend to be totally detrimental to the dignity of the women prisoners, and also tend to be also detrimental to the dignity of the offenders, and hence the prison system tend to fail to reform the prisoners, and often have become subject of scorn, because it tends to perpetuate the criminal mentality of the prisoners, as it does deprives them of any chance to reform themselves during their serving the sentence within the prison. So here we find that when you talk, so here we come to understand that both men and women now tend to be the members of the same criminal justice system, the same jails, and we can hardly see that there is any difference in the prison system as far as availability of facilities for the male and women prisoners, although there are different needs for the so-called for both men and women. So I think when you talk about the India and the world, we all know that and often I think if you have seen the movie of the Last Emperor, as you know, Last Emperor movie, we see that it is only the communism which tends to believe that it is the society which tends to contribute towards an increasing criminal mentality of the individuals, rather than the individuals themselves. We all know that no individual is born to be a criminal, and people tend to often become criminal by virtue of their peculiar social circumstances, then by virtue of the self-motivation. But there could be, but then the liberal belief is that probably people tend to be having self-motivation, but nonetheless, the broad understanding is that people tend to become criminals by virtue of being victims of certain circumstances, rather than being guided by their own self-motivation. And it's always believed that the criminals tend to be, nobody is a born criminal from out of the mother's home. And ever since we tend to believe in social learning, people tend to become criminals by virtue of the social learning, whatever they learn from within the society, rather than having any kind of an esoteric mentality where they do not have any extra divine power, which tends to make them criminals. But nonetheless, we are not trying to glorify the acts of the crime, but we are now here from the human rights perspective, we are trying to understand as to why people tend to become criminal, and whether the present day criminal justice system does contribute towards people being proved as criminals, or the criminals who are later day category prisoners tend to be the victims of the injustices which may be present within the criminal justice system of any country, and whether they are given any chance of, or whether they are given any or afforded any chance to reform themselves as the prison system was devised of, and also to understand as to why the criminals tend to not become reformed persons and remain as criminals. I think we all know in the paper, when you read, the criminals tend to, even after release, after having served the required sentence of imprisonment, when they come back to society, they again commit the same crime and want to go back to the jails, simply because they find the situation in the society not hospitable to their normal living, and they tend to find the conditions within the prison much better than what they tend to face in the society. But nonetheless, we'll not go back into detail. It's a huge important issue, but we'll come back to again in some form or the other. But nonetheless, since we're talking in general about the prison system and the criminal justice system, we all have to understand that the function of the criminal justice system and the conceptualization of the prison was primarily to bring back the so-called deviant persons of the human society into normal human beings, so as to enable them to live a normal life, rather than to live the life of a condemnation, which tends to have both economic and social cost, and tend to continue in the nature of a burden than of any kind of an asset for the society, as the society tends to look for socio-economic development in order to call itself to be a developed society. So I think when we say that there is an increase in the number of, I can show you the figures, there is an increase in the number of women offenders as well. The prison system, which nonetheless continues to be scary, which didn't have the adequate facilities for the male prisoners, now is faced with the challenge of providing various facilities to women prisoners, which it finds very, very difficult, given the fact that there is a rise in the number of women offenders and their subsequent imprisonment in the so-called jails, which do not have any particular provision for women enclosures. But given the fact that there is pressure coming from NHRC, from various judicial courts, including the Supreme Court, there have been certain women enclosures in certain jails, but most of the jails will find that they do not have very, very secure, isolated women enclosures, and not to speak of women jails. But I think since this lecture we are talking of India, we need to look at the NCRB report, and in the NCRB report we find that the NCRB report tends to point out to us that the total number of women prisoners tend to have risen every passing year. When we compare the figures, and we see according to 2021, the published report of the NCRB, National Crime Records Bureau, we find that that out of the total of 55 lakhs, 5,54,034 prisoners lost in prisons, we find they say almost 22,918 were female prisoners. So here we find that from at one point of time, from having no women prisoners, so in NCRB report says that there has been an increase in the number of total number of women prisoners as well, while there is out of 5,54,034 prisoners lost in various prisons all over the country, 22,918 were female prisoners. And there is also within the prison system, as we've been talking about transgender issues, there has also been an increase in the number of the transgender prisoners, where we find that NCRB report also said there is also 91 transgender prisoners can also be found to be inmates of various prisons all over the country. So here we can see there is a fair amount of prison population tends to be women, as evident from the statistics, and this has been a huge increase in the figure when we compare the number of women prisoners in 2015 and that of 2021. In 2015, while there were the women prisoners numbered only 17,834, now there seems to be an increase in their number by about 5,000 in number. So out of all these, we find when you look into the total percentage of women prisoners, we find that there seems to be 17% of the prisoners who happen to be the women prisoners within the various jails of our own country. So 17% of women prisoners, when you talk about it, seems to be a very high figure, given the fact that the prison system do not have adequate facilities for the women prisoners for their specific gender needs. And we find that while 17% of the women prisoners tend to be there, the majority, while majority of them are housed in female enclosures of the so-called general prisons, and not all of them are able to live in women prisons simply because that there is a shortage of women prisons, and women prisons have not been provided in all these central jails or all kind of jails within our own country. And women prisoners, by living in enclosures within the general prisons, tend to often become victims of various abuses by the prisoners, not to speak of the prison guards, and hence the conditions of the women prisons tend to be very, very palpable. And we also find that despite large population of women prisoners, their conditions tend to have remained very, very unnoticed. We are talking women prisoners because, while the male prisoners have been talked about, a lot of things have been written about, and a lot of data has been collected about male prisoners. It seems the data about the women prisoners tend to be very, very scarce, simply because that, as it happens in case of the Indian widows, the women prisoners, the day they are condemned to serve sentences of in any prison, they seem to be almost forgotten lot in our present day society. And that is how we thought that it is always important to focus on the so-called neglected, often forgotten, marginalized communities within our own society, rather than talk of the so-called visible sections of which enough is known, and enough is probably being done, and enough is probably being written about. There may be difference of opinion whether enough is for the male prisoners or not, but we know that over the period of time there has been an improvement in certain facilities, and given the fact that men do not have too much of differentiated needs as compared with women, the women prisoners do need the specific attention. They deserve of being members of a different gender, and also of belonging to the so-called weaker sections within our own society that is known largely as a patriarchal society. So here we find that as per the National Crime Records Bureau, when you look into the data, we find that the number of prisoners lodged in various jails, although has drastically increased, right up to 5,54,034 prisoners in 2021. There has been a marked increase in the number of prisoners by about 13.4% during this period. From 2018 to 2022, we find there has been a substantial increase. So, and although it might be occurring to us that in a society which has, India now has almost 1.45 billion population, having more than 5 lakh people as prisoners is not a matter of scarce. But as we know, since prisons are scary, since prisons, presence of prisons tend to be treated as obnoxious simply because it tends to represent the negative side of the society. All the sensible intellectuals are concerned about the fact that probably there is a need for the abolition of the prison system, and also reworking of the conditions within the society should be such that nobody feels any need for committing any crime against the society so as to be sentenced to serve the prison. I think if this is, we all agree that if situation in the society would improve, if situations of hunger, poverty, deprivation, and other kind of social torture or discrimination can improve, then probably nobody would feel it fine to take to the path of crime. So anyway, so that is the logic of the so-called social reformers who tend to advocate that the social situation must change if any society, any civilization, or any race will call itself a civilized race. But then, given the fact that as the situation stands today, there has been an increase in the number of prisoners up to 13.4%, and we find that while the total capacity of the prisons to house the prisoners tend to be only about 4,88,511. In other words, we find that the capacity of the jail seems to be limited, while there is a substantial increase with every subsequent passing year in the number of the prisoners, which tends to have led to the overcrowding of the so-called existing prisons within our own country. When you look into, just to scare you a bit, so that we know that there are also prisoners who tend to be members of our own society, but living a secluded life in an isolated manner in the prison. These figures need to be remembered so as to make us sensitized about the problems that are present in our own society and also inside the prisons. We find that there are in the central jails of the country, we find that there are the highest capacity. The central jails of the country tend to have the highest capacity, while the other jails which tend to be present in the various districts and in the sub districts tend to be very, very limited. And when you look into central jails, we find that the central jails, I think when you watch any kind of movies, the Hindi movies, they show you central jails. They don't show you the district jails, because the central jails are shown because the central jails tend to house a large number of prisoners than the district jails or the sub jails, because their capacity is limited. And when you look into central jails, we find 21, we find the central jails of the country tend to have at house 1,93,536 people, followed by the district jails, which had 1,63,606 prisoners, and the sub jails tend to have had 45,436 prisoners. Amongst these prisoners, we find that the sub jails, although have only had the had a limited capacity, but they still tend to have had to accommodate a large number of prisoners, which tend to have become issues of human rights violation. And here, when you go a little further, we find that the highest number of inmates which had to be lodged in district jails, district jails which number all about 2,54,214, and the central jails had a lesser number of people, 2,39,311 people, and sub jails tend to have had accommodated 46,736 prisoners as on 31st December 2021. Why we talk the number? Because when we talk of the prisoners prison system, we find that the most of the prisons, whether they are in central jails, they are state jails, district jails, or they are sub jails, they have been asked to accommodate more people than what was their original capacity. And here we find that when you talk of the women inmates, we find the total number of women inmates tend to have been 3,808 as per the report published by the NCRB, which is titled Women in Prisons, published by the Ministry of Women and Child Development. There are almost 4,19,623 persons in jails in India, and women prisoners constituted 4.3% of the figure, which tend to have numbered 17,834 women prisoners. And the most important of concern in the prison is that of all these 17,000, more than 7,000 women prisoners, the number of under trial women prisoners tend to have been the largest within the figure of 17,000 women prisoners. And it's so, and we all know that in the prison, when you talk of the prison system seems to be having both the people who have been convicted by the various courts of law, and it also has another interesting category of people who are awaiting trial by the courts of law, who are known as under trial prisoners, or within bracket UTPs. And amongst these 17,834 people, we find that 66.8% of the people which number 11,916 people, tend to be under trial prisoners. As we know that if you have been following the judgments of the Supreme Court and the various pronouncements of the National Human Rights Commission, one must have come across the fact that there have been various issues which have been flagged by them about the under trial prisoners, where the completion of the trial tend to have taken many years longer than what would be the original term they would have served in the prison had their offense been proved by the court of law. So while as you find that under the criminal procedure code, under the CPC, you will find while in certain grave offences tend to have only minimum 7 years of rigorous imprisonment, it is often seen that under trial prisoners tend to be waiting for their trial for more than that 7 years, and often number about 11 years before their trial commences in the courts of law because of the huge pendency of cases. But for the women prisoners, it has become a matter of concern simply because that the 66%, more than 66% of the women inmates of the various jails within our own country tend to be under trial prisoners, and minority of them happen to be the convicted ones. And if you go a little further, we find that when you analyze the prison statistics at 5-year intervals, we find that the number of prisoners has shown an increase, and that is about 3.3% of all prisoners used to be women in 2000, while when you come to 2005, their number increased by 3.9%, and as on 2010, we could see that the number swelled by about 4.1%, and by 2015, 4.3% were the women prisoners. And a majority of the female inmates, as we could see, they are in the age group of 30 to 50 years, which constituted 50.5%, followed by the second largest number of women prisoners, which who were in the age group of 18 to 30 years. And of the total 1,401 prisons that are having women inmates, we find that the most of the prisons tend to have no women prisons, which has become a matter of concern. I think when you talk of it's always right that it is always right to say that, well, if somebody is a deviant to somebody has violated the law, he or she must serve the prison sentence, and what is the logic of talking about them, but as we know, human rights seem to be available to human beings, whether they are inside the prison or outside the prison. As we tend to be enjoying the same human rights have also been made available to women, are to be made available to women prisoners, and the women prisoners are not to be denied any kind of human right just because they have been sentenced to sub imprisonment, and should be denied the basic rights as is expected in the case of a civilized society. I think when you go a little further, we find that women prisoners tend to, and then there have been several attempts by the criminal justice system, by the various criminal courts and the NHRC to improve the conditions of prison system within the country in general. But we find mostly, while there have been some attempts at providing situations to male prisoners, to mostly the male prisons inside the country, there has been probably very scant attention which has been paid to women prisoners. And despite several attempts which have been made by our country, starting from Justice Krishna Iyer Committee, which was appointed in 1987 to examine the situation of women in prisons, we find that the conditions tend to have not changed for the better. The National Expert Committee on Women Prisoners, headed by Krishna Iyer, tend to have framed a draft model prison manual. Chapter 23 of the manual tend to have provided for certain special provision to be made available for the children of women prisoners. Although the manual was circulated to various states and have been often raised by Supreme Court, hardly much has changed. And I think when you go a little further, we find that if you visit women prisoners, we find the women prisoners tend to face a lot of difficulties within the prison, from bed infrastructure to overcrowding, and even some jails tend to have no basic facilities such as electricity or fans in the rooms or clean bathrooms and toilets, which are very, very necessary for the women prisoners given their specific gender needs. I think when you go a little further, we find that women's health needs, be it mental, be it physical, be it other kind of reproductive health, it tends to have also not received adequate attention inside the jail, and there has been often demands have been raised that there is a need for immediate improvement in the improvement of the facilities which are existing within the central jails, where the prisoners would be able to live the life of dignity and would not be subjected to any kind of a human right violation as they tend to be subjected to at present. But nonetheless, we find that despite the NHRC's functioning and NHRC monitoring of the present-day jail conditions, we still find that the prison condition seems to be continuing in the same form, with a bit of change here and there. But those changes, we can talk about it. But we find that my personal opinion after a visit to jails is that the conditions have not changed, and only thing is that maybe a paint has been applied somewhere, but about the health and other facilities, we still have a long way to go than what is talked about. But I think recently, if we have after the President Draupadi Murmu tends to have taken over as the President of the Rashtrapati of the country, during her speech on the day of the on the Constitution Day, which we observe on November 26th every year, she not only flagged the issues of the women, the prisoners' conditions in the various jails within our own country, and in the same meeting, which had the presence of the Prime Minister of the country, Prime Minister Modi, and the Chief Justice of the country, she also flagged as to how there is a need for setting up of a quick justice dispersal system which will lead to the reduction of the number of duty under trial prisoners, and also will also result in the betterment of the improvement conditions. There is also, and the Chief Justice of India himself has also, the President Chief Justice of India has also flagged the concern as to how the justice system needs to improve. The justice delivery system needs to be reoriented towards the reduction of the under trial prisoners, and also for improvement of the better day condition, the improvement of the better conditions in the jails. But we still find that the the reforms in the prison, whenever they are talked about, probably people tend to be more scary than what they tend to be talked about. In our own research, we have pointed out to the fact that while there is a general requirement for the improvement of the facilities within the prison system as of today, the more emphasis should be on the restorative justice system rather than on the punitive aspect, because only with the restorative justice system, the prisoners after having served the sentences would feel encouraged to be socially reintegrated into the society, rather than what the punitive system makes them to be, which is what they have become the object of scorn. I think, and here in our own research, we have also pointed to the fact as to how the women prisoners tend to be faced with general issues of structural exclusion within the prison, where the prisons tend to be contributing towards their mental loss or mental insanity, then enabling them as productive human beings, which they are expected to be after they have served their prison. And in our own research, we have also emphasized on the continuous monitoring processes, availability of the legal aid to the women prisoners to be able to avail temporary parole from the jail, so as to be able to spend their time with their immediate family, and also accountability of the jail and police administration, so as to cleanse the existing criminal justice system from the kind of defects that they are now filled with, which will lead to a better human society. I think when you talk, and we all know that probably, I think you must have come across the fact that if you look into the number of prisoners seeking parole from the prisons, which is a temporary release, the number of women prisoners seeking parole is much less than that of the male prisoners, because of the fact that the women tend to be unaware of the legal aid provisions, while the male tend to be aware of the legal provisions, which enables them to seek parole and get temporary relief from the prisons. I think in our own research, we have also emphasized on the fact that the prisons, as has been the objective of the prison system, the correctional aspect should be more emphasized than merely condemning them into prison system, which tends to deprive the society of the so-called human beings, besides the human dignity, of which everyone is entitled to. I think I picked up this issue simply because that we have all seen that probably whenever we talk of any issue, we tend to be talking less of the prisoners and tend to be treating them as object of scorn, then as equal human, then as member of the same society of which we are part of. I think I will end it here, and it is a sensitization process for me, so that I would be sensitizing as researcher, as academician, as teachers, as fellow citizens, to bring about the issues of concern before everyone's attention, so as to give a boost to the reform process, as is the need of the day, rather than forget the issues and go ahead with our own issues, which tends to be working to a very selective section's benefit, then what we should be doing as responsible members of the human society. I think I will end my lecture here. I thank you for paying attention to this particular human rights issue, and which is acquiring more and more strength, given the fact that our constitutional office holders are now pointing attention to this oft forgotten community, which has been forced to live the life of condemnation rather than the life of correction. Thank you very much. If you want to ask something, you can always ask. I do not know why you keep quiet. There's no point saying thank you. You should be able to raise some issues. Participants, you always don't lose a chance to ask a question, because we will never get a chance to meet each other very soon. So whenever we are on a platform, frame a question from any perspective and try to see that a dialogue takes place. Do you hear me? Do you hear me? Hello? Hello?
Sir.
Haji.
Yeah. Sir, one participant, he is asking, no, why do you think that prisoner warden abuse the inmates?
I think we all know that, I think you probably, the participants must have, why I talk of films in the presentation is that because, everything we cannot show, everybody cannot make a film on every social situation that is present in the human society. And we know the films are our own mirrors. We should not take films very lightly, because films are our own mirrors, and films often tell us what we do not see, or what we do not perceive, or what we do not believe in. I think one of the very famous film which has been made on police atrocity, which is known as Gangajal. It's a Hindi movie, but here you find the Ajay Devgan, the protagonist, the hero, tends to be talking about that whatever ills are present in the society gets transferred to the police system, and get transferred to any other system that is present within the same society. And because of the fact that when you look into the larger society, we also see that how there has been increase in the kind of offences that are being committed against the women, and which has been conceptualized by the so-called feminist as gender-based violence. I think when you look into our own society, we find that we do not treat our women very, very honorably. We not only subject them to wife battering, we also tend to commit various other reprehensible sexual offences, which includes rape and murder. I think given the fact that the patriarchal society tends to patronize in a way such acts, and tends to not condemn such acts with as much force and wisdom as it should, human beings tend to continue the same crimes in whichever position they are placed in, with some bit of a power. I think that is how we find that, given the fact that women are abused by men in the outside the prison, in the society, the same men who, when they are in some powerful position, tend to commit the same offences with the belief that probably they would not be punished as brutally as they would be punished if they do it in open society. I think the overall, as we know, that the society has to be blamed for such acts being committed by men against the women. And I think during the COVID time, there was a kind of a joke which said that the animals were safe because the men were all indoors, the human beings were indoors. I think there's also a saying that women probably would be safe if the men are indoors. But given the fact that that kind of issue is not possible, there is a need that society has to be educated as to how everyone's right needs to be respected, honored, protected, and preserved, rather than being violated by anybody, whether one is in a position of power or one is in a position of trust. I think the society has to blame for any kind of abuse of rights, whether it's a women prisoners or abuse of person belonging to any any deprivation, be it a person belonging to scheduled caste, scheduled tribe, or any other, or women, or any other kind of a community. Nobody's human rights should be violated, and everyone's human rights should be considered to be as important, as significant, as salient, or as honorable a thing to do as we do for our own rights.
Sir, thank you, sir. Sir,
Yes,
another participant, Tanusri Kundu, she posted one question that, sir, when it came to accept the by the society that what is the status of women prisoner via a vice male prisoner? Do the society given the women prisoner as fair chance to be a part of the society after serving the prisoner time?
I think in this context, we have been talking about it yesterday when we were talking about a presentation. We were saying that the society tends to be largely hostile to both male and female prisoners, simply because as you know, the moment we tend to know that there is a person who is staying next door to us who has served a sentence, we tend to be filled up with all the negative thoughts about him, rather than believing that the person may have corrected himself by having served the sentence and may have become a better human being than what he used to be. And when it comes to women, I think given the fact that women in India tends to have a lower social status, despite all the efforts of the government of India and the constitution to have equal status vis-a-vis men, but women tend to be the object of double jeopardy, simply because that women because of the vulnerability that because they suffered from vulnerability because of having served the sentence in the prison, they tend to become object of the men's attention very, very negatively, and which tends to make their life much more unbearable. I think human beings can be probably we are talking of the reforms in the judicial system, and I think when human beings are given a different identity, if permitted by the law of the land, and different ICAR, different kind of a and given a different place to live, much further from their own habitat, where people will not be able to discover their antecedents, then they'll be able to live as normal human being. But until we're able to give them any alternative status, alternative identity, they would continue to be hunted by the society for the simple thing that they have served some prison sentence, be it for their own acts or be it for the so-called weaknesses that they are present in the criminal justice system.
Thank you, sir. Sir, one more question I will take up. One is asking one participant, Praveen, Sabnam Praveen. Sir, various intellectuals say we don't need prison system. Do you also believe in that?
I think, yeah, I started my lecture with saying prisons are, why I gave you a very horrifying picture of the prison system, because as they continue, they seem to be very, very scary. They seem to be inhospitable. They seem to be almost dungeon houses. I think they seem to be almost like the haunted houses, which we are afraid of going when we are children. Even now, we will not go into haunted houses simply because we have been told that haunted houses seems to be filled up with all the negative elements, which will cause more harm to us than good to us. I think the prison system is of such nature that anybody who is asked to serve this under the prison tends to be very clear that one may not be able to come back alive. I think in that context we have found that how the prison system tend to have not been able to bring about a change in the human behavior even after the serving of the sentence, and hence the prison system tends to have defeated its own purpose of being a correctional system. I think in the context of enabling people to live a normal life, in the context of enabling the so-called human beings to be productive human beings during their lifetime, there has been often talk and writings in the international circles about alternative to the prison system, where if you talk about Australia, if you talk about New Zealand, if you talk of other Nordic countries, we find that there have been the people are being punished alternatively, where instead of being put in some kind of these iron-clad enclosures, they are being now encouraged to live in open jails, where they are being encouraged to be as more productive as human beings are outside the prison system, and are able to prove themselves to be corrected human beings than what we see in the Indian prison system. I think we need to talk about alternative to prison system where inside the prison, while there is a waste of human resource in the open prison, if the prison system could be converted into some kind of a production center where people with different skills would be able to be engaged to would remain engaged in producing certain goods and services which are of great need to the human society. Human beings will be able to correct themselves faster than what they do in the so-called prison system. I think in certain prison system, in the certain countries, they have also encouraged the so-called, conjugal life of the prisoners, where it is believed that when human beings tend to live with their immediate family members, they are able to reform themselves quickly than what they do in terms of isolation. But then these are all Western experiments, which the Nordic countries, if you look into literature, one will discover that they have these innovative steps have proved to be much more beneficial than what we are doing with the so-called prison system, which was devised by the colonial masters and which is serving no purpose. I believe in a kind of an alternative prison system, and where prisons would be converted into production centers rather than mere imprisonment for people, which is a great waste of human resources.
Yeah, sir. I think now we should stop because already 10 minutes we are late, and 1:30 again we have to resume the class. So thank you so much, sir, for giving your valuable time, and the way you presented the things. It is many, and especially both your topic, multiculturalism and this jail related things are very informative, and new things, many things I also learned by listening your lecture. So thank you so much, sir, for your valuable time and spending your time. My office will contact you, sir, for further official procedure, whatever the left. So dear participant, for you, now you go and take your lunch fast, and exactly we will start 1:30. Okay, so please be online at 1:30.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Professor Manoj Kumar Barma and Professor Bhartendu Singh, for the opportunity to be with you this great morning. And as always, it has been a kind of a memorable time for me, and I look forward to better opportunities for